Chapter 23 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 23, The 7 Days' Battles. After the Battle of Fair Oaks, as well as before it, General McClellan kept up his continual cry for reinforcements. The hallucination that the enemy's force was double his own had become fixed upon him, and all his plans and combinations were poisoned by this fatal error. The President did everything in his power to satisfy the General's unreasonable demands. He resolved to give him absolute control of all the troops on the peninsula, and knowing that General Wool would never consent to being placed under McClellan's orders, that veteran having expressed himself with characteristic severity in regard to his junior's insatiable demand for troops, the President thought best to remove General Wool to Baltimore, transferring General Dix to Fort Monroe and placing him under the direct command of McClellan, a proceeding which greatly displeased General Dix, but to which he yielded under protest. His displeasure did not interfere with his convictions of duty. Immediately on arriving at Fort Monroe, he sent to General McClellan a reinforcement of 10 of the best regiments there. No efforts were spared to help and to encourage McClellan. Both the President and the Secretary of War were perpetually sending him kind and complimentary messages in addition to the troops and guns which they gathered in from every quarter for him. A few days after Fair Oaks, in response to his repeated entreaties, McCall's division of McDowell's corps, a splendid body of about 10,000 men, was dispatched to him. He was for the moment delighted at hearing that these troops were coming, and having thus obtained the greater part of McDowell's corps, he said, June 7, "I am glad to learn that you are pressing forward reinforcements so vigorously. I shall be in perfect readiness to move forward and take Richmond the moment McCall reaches here, and the ground will admit the passage of artillery." McCall and his perfectly appointed division of 10,000 men and 5 batteries of artillery began to arrive on the 11th, and were all present for duty on the 13th. And as if Providence were uniting with the Government to satisfy both the General's requirements, he was able to telegraph on the 12th, "Weather now good, roads and ground rapidly drying." The weather continued remarkably fine for several days. General Keyes, on the 15th, reported White Oak Swamp dried up so as to be fordable in many places. But the dry spell did not last, and on the night of the 15th, General McClellan sends to Washington a note of lamentation, saying that the rain has begun again, which will retard our movements somewhat. It is characteristic of him that he always regarded bad weather as exclusively injurious to him and never to the other side. The President once said of him that he seemed to think, in defiance of Scripture, that heaven sent its rain only on the just and not on the unjust. To an energetic general, all kinds of weather have their uses. Johnston did not allow the terrible storm of May 30 to prevent his attack at Seven Pines, and we have seen how Grant, at the very outset of his career, speaking of the bad weather and the wretched roads on which he had to march, said, "This, however, will operate worse upon the enemy than upon us." It must not be forgotten that although McClellan and his apologists have been for years denouncing the Government for having withheld from him McDowell's corps, the best part of that corps was actually sent to him. Franklin's magnificent division went to him in April. McCall's equally fine division was dispatched to him before the middle of June. In each case, he said he only awaited the coming of that particular division to undertake immediate active operations, and in each case, on the arrival of the eagerly demanded reinforcements, he did nothing but wait the good pleasure of the enemy. His own official reports show that he received by way of reinforcements after his arrival in the peninsula and prior to the 15th of June not less than 39,441 men, of whom there were 32,360 present for duty. Yet all this counted for nothing with him. He let hardly a day pass without clamoring for more. He was not even inclined to allow the administration any discretion in regard to the manner in which he was to be reinforced. He insisted that McDowell should be sent to him by water and not by land, so that he should come in by his rear instead of by his right flank. And when he was informed that McCall's force was expected to be restored to McDowell's corps when that army joined him, he bitterly resented it. He said it did not show a proper spirit in McDowell, and added sullenly, "If I cannot fully control all his troops, I want none of them, but would prefer to fight the battle with what I have, and let others be responsible for the results." These petulant outbursts were met with unwearied patience and kindness on the part of the President. On the 15th of June he wrote: "The Secretary of War has turned over to me your dispatch about sending McDowell to you by water instead of by land. I now fear he cannot get to you either way in time. Shields's division has got so terribly out of shape, out at elbows and out at toes, that it will require a long time to get it in again. I expect to see McDowell within a day or two, when I will again talk with him about the mode of moving. McCall's division has nearly or quite reached you by now. This, with what you get from General Wool's old command and the new regiments sent you, must give you an increase, since the late battles, of over 20,000. Doubtless the battles and other causes have decreased you half as much in the same time, but then the enemy have lost as many in the same way. I believe I would come and see you were it not that I fear my presence might divert you and the army from more important matters." From this it will be seen that McClellan had no right to delay operations an hour after McCall's arrival from any pretended expectation of the immediate coming of McDowell, and indeed he admits in his report that as early as the 7th of June he had given up any such expectation. With no reason, therefore, for delay, but with every conceivable incentive to action, with an army amounting after McCall joined him to the imposing figure of 156,838, of whom an aggregate present of 127,327 is reported by McClellan himself as of the 20th of June, though he makes a reduction to 114,691 of those present for duty equipped. He wasted the month of June in a busy and bustling activity, which was in its results equivalent to mere idleness. He was directly invited to attack by the fine weather of the middle of the month, which he describes as splendid in a dispatch of the 17th, and by the absence of Stonewall Jackson in the Valley, with his 16,000 veterans, reinforced by 10,000 troops from Lee's army, as McClellan himself believed and reported on the 18th. The President, by a dispatch of the same date, urged him to take advantage of this opportunity, saying, "If this is true, it is as good as a reinforcement to you of an equal force. I could better dispose of things if I could know about what day you can attack Richmond, and would be glad to be informed if you think you can inform me with safety." The terms in which General McClellan answered this inquiry are worthy of quotation as an illustration of that air of energy and determination which he so often introduced into the expression of his intentions, while leaving, as in the last lines of this dispatch, a loophole for indefinite delay. Our army is well over the Chickahominy, except the very considerable forces necessary to protect our flanks and communications. Our whole line of pickets in front runs within 6 miles of Richmond. The rebel line runs within musket range of ours. Each has heavy support at hand. A general engagement may take place any hour. An advance by us involves a battle more or less decisive. The enemy exhibit at every point a readiness to meet us. They certainly have great numbers and extensive works. If 10,000 or 15,000 men have left Richmond to reinforce Jackson, it illustrates their strength and confidence. This is a singularly characteristic view. The fact of a large detachment having left Lee affords him no encouragement. It simply impresses him all the more with the idea of his enemy's strength. After tomorrow we shall fight the rebel army as soon as Providence will permit. We shall await only a favorable condition of the earth and sky, and the completion of some necessary preliminaries. As usual, it was the enemy that startled McClellan out of his procrastination. On the 13th of June, General J.E.B. Stuart, with some 1,200 Confederate cavalry and a few guns, started to ride around McClellan's army, touching on his way the South Anna Railroad Bridge, Hanover Courthouse, Tunstall Station on the York River Railway, and thence to Jones's Bridge on the Chickahominy, which he stopped to repair, crossing it on the 15th, and entering Richmond by the river road the next day. It has rarely been the fortune of a general to inflict such an insult upon an opponent without injury. General McClellan did not seem to feel that any discredit attached to him for this performance. On the contrary, he congratulated himself that Stuart had done so little harm. The burning of 2 schooners laden with forage and 14 government wagons, the destruction of some sutlers' stores, the killing of several of the guard and teamsters at Garlick's Landing, some little damage done at Tunstall Station, and a little éclat were the precise results of this expedition. McClellan had for some time been vaguely meditating a change of base to the James River, and this raid of Stuart's seems to have somewhat strengthened this purpose. Fitzjohn Porter, who more than any other possessed his confidence, says that McClellan desired to effect this movement as soon as he gave up looking for McDowell to join him, which, we have seen from his report, was in the first week of June. As early as June 18, Porter says, he sent vessels loaded with supplies to the James River. It is not intended to intimate that he was fully resolved upon this course, but he appears to have kept it constantly before him in his undecided, irresolute way all through the month. His communication with Commodore John Rodgers, who commanded on the James, indicates a purpose to move to some point on that river. He says on the 24th, "In a few days I hope to gain such a position as to enable me to place a force above Ball's and Drury's bluffs, so that we can remove the obstructions and place ourselves in communication with you so that you can cooperate in the final attack. In the meantime, please keep some gunboats as near Drury's bluff as prudence will permit." On the 25th, he pushed forward his picket line in front of Seven Pines to within 4 miles of Richmond, a point farther in advance than he had yet reached. At the same time, he issued orders to his corps commanders south of the river that they were not to regard these new positions as their field of battle, but were to fall back, if attacked, to their old intrenchments. He had by this time heard of the arrival of Jackson's corps, and also credited a false and impossible rumor of the arrival of Beauregard and his troops from the West. He was fully informed of the attack threatened within a few hours, and yet he sent to Washington for more troops. "If I had another good division, I could laugh at Jackson," he said, while he knew that Jackson was marching upon his right. He made his usual complaint and threat of putting the responsibility where it belonged. These wanton accusations at such a time moved the President not to anger but to genuine sorrow. Yet he answered with almost incredible patience, "Your 3 dispatches of yesterday in relation to the affair, ending with the statement that you completely succeeded in making your point, are very gratifying. The later one, suggesting the probability of your being overwhelmed by 200,000, and talking of where the responsibility will belong, pains me very much. I give you all I can, and act on the presumption that you will do the best you can with what you have, while you continue ungenerously, I think, to assume that I could give you more if I would. I have omitted and shall omit no opportunity to send you reinforcements whenever I possibly can. It is impossible to say how long his desultory preparations would have lasted if General McClellan had been left to himself, but after the 23rd of June the power of deciding upon what day he should attack had already passed out of his hands. General Lee had made at his leisure all his arrangements for attacking the Union army, and had chosen the time and manner of onset, as Johnston did a month before, without the slightest reference to any possible initiative of McClellan. He had during the month allowed him, by the inactivity of his opponent, brought together from every available source a great army, almost equal in numbers to the Army of the Potomac. Though there is a great disparity in the accounts of the different Confederate officers who have written upon this subject, there is no reason to doubt that the official estimate quoted with approval by General Webb, which states Lee's force as 80,762, is substantially correct. Webb says that McClellan's effective force for the 7 days' battles was 92,500, considerably less than his own official report of the 20th of June gives him, which, exclusive of Dix's force, was 105,445. The Confederate forces were, like the army opposed to them, of the best material the country could furnish, and no better men ever went to war in any age or region. It is an unsolved and now an insolvable question whether the Confederates had gained or lost by the wounding of Johnston and the substitution of Lee as the commander of their principal army. They were both men of the best ability and highest character that the Southern States could produce, both trained soldiers of calm temper and great energy, and both equally honorable and magnanimous in their treatment of their subordinates. But General Lee had a great advantage over his predecessor in possessing the perfect confidence and personal friendship of Jefferson Davis, the head of the Confederate government. He was always sure in his enterprises of what Johnston often lacked, the sincere and zealous support of the Richmond government. He also enjoyed to an unusual degree the warm regard and esteem of those who were brought into personal or official relations with him. His handsome and attractive presence, his dignified yet cordial manner, a certain sincerity and gentleness which was apparent in all his words and actions, endeared him to his associates and made friends of strangers at first sight. Everything he asked for was given him. He had been the favorite of General Scott in the old army. He became the favorite of Mr. Davis in his new command. The army which Johnston gave up to him had been almost doubled in numbers by the time he considered himself ready to employ it against McClellan. Lee's preparations were promptly and energetically made. Immediately after Stuart's raid was completed, he ordered Stonewall Jackson to join him by a letter of the 16th, which gave minute instructions for his march, and enjoined upon him the greatest secrecy and swiftness. To mask this movement, he ostentatiously sent Jackson 2 brigades from Richmond, with drums beating and colors flying, a proceeding which was promptly reported to McClellan and caused him at first some perplexity, but which he explained by his usual conclusion that Lee had so overwhelming a force that a few brigades here or there made no difference to him. The maneuver was of little practical account, however, as McClellan was fully informed of Jackson's approach in time to provide against it, or to anticipate his arrival by taking the offensive. He even knew as early as the 25th that Jackson was to come in on his right and rear, but he made no use of this knowledge except to reproach the government for not sending him more troops. Jackson reported at Richmond in person on the 23rd of June in advance of his corps, and in a conference with Longstreet and the two Hills, the plan of attacking the Federal right wing north of the Chickahominy was agreed upon. As Jackson's troops had the greatest distance to march, it was left to him to say when the attack should be made. He named the morning of the 26th of June, giving himself, as it afterwards appeared, too little time. General Lee matured his plan on the 24th and issued his orders for the coming campaign. The most striking thing about them is his evident contempt for his opponent. He sent, in effect, full two-thirds of his army to the north side of the Chickahominy to strike McClellan's right wing. The enemy is to be driven from Mechanicsville. The Confederates are to sweep down the Chickahominy and endeavor to drive the enemy from his position above New Bridge. General Jackson, bearing well to his left, turning Beaver Dam Creek and taking the direction towards Cold Harbor. They will then press forward towards the York River Railroad, closing upon the enemy's rear and forcing him down the Chickahominy. Any advance of the enemy towards Richmond will be prevented by vigorously following his rear and crippling and arresting his progress. He anticipated the possibility of McClellan's abandoning his intrenchments on the south side of the river, in which case he is to be closely pursued by Huger and Magruder. Cavalry were to occupy the roads to arrest his flight down the Chickahominy. General Lee's plan and expectation was, in short, to herd and drive down the peninsula a magnificent army, superior in numbers to his own and not inferior in any other respect, if we except the respective generals commanding, who were at least equally distinguished engineers. In this enterprise he deserved and courted defeat by leaving the bulk of McClellan's army between himself and Richmond. When he laid his plan before Jefferson Davis, the latter saw at once this serious defect in it. He says, "I pointed out to him that our force and entrenched line between that left flank of the enemy and Richmond was too weak for a protracted resistance, and if McClellan was the man I took him for, as soon as he found that the bulk of our army was on the north side of the Chickahominy, he would not stop to try conclusions with it there, but would immediately move upon his objective point, the city of Richmond. If, on the other hand, he should behave like an engineer officer and deem it his first duty to protect his line of communication, I thought the plan proposed was not only the best, but would be a success." Something of his old esprit de corps manifested itself in General Lee's first response, that he did not know engineer officers were more likely than others to make such mistakes, but immediately passing to the main subject, he added, "If you will hold him as long as you can at the intrenchments, and then fall back on the detached works around the city, I will be upon the enemy's heels before he gets there." But everything shows he anticipated no such action on the part of McClellan. All his orders, all his dispositions indicate clearly that he thought of nothing but driving him down the Chickahominy towards Yorktown and capturing or dispersing his army. The measure of success he met with will always be, in the general judgment, a justification of his plan. But the opinion of the best military critics on both sides is that it never could have succeeded had it not been for McClellan's hallucination as to the numbers opposed to him. From the hour that Lee crossed his troops over the Chickahominy, leaving that river and McClellan's army between him and Richmond, he risked the fate of the Confederacy upon his belief that the Union general would make no forward movement. His confidence grew with every step of McClellan's retreat from Beaver Dam Creek to Malvern Hill, and was dearly paid for in the blood of his soldiers. The first meeting between the two armies resulted in a terrible defeat for the Confederates. About 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 26th, the rebel forces, commanded by Longstreet, D. H. Hill, and A. P. Hill, attacked the Union troops in position on the east side of Beaver Dam Creek, commanded by General McCall, whose division had been added to Fitz-John Porter's corps. McCall's brigade commanders were Truman Seymour, Meade, and John F. Reynolds. Of the last two, the one gained an undying fame, and the other a glorious death at Gettysburg. The Confederates were in greatly superior force, but the Union troops had the advantage of position, and though both sides fought with equal valor, before night fell the rebels were repulsed with great slaughter. General McClellan visited Fitzjohn Porter's headquarters at night after the battle. He found an exultant and victorious army, almost unscathed by the fierce conflict of the day. Porter reports his loss at 250 out of the 5,000 engaged, and says the enemy lost nearly 2,000 of their 10,000 attacking. If Porter, instead of McClellan, had been in command of the army, Richmond might have been under the Union flag the next day. His soldierly spirit, flushed with the day's success, comprehended the full advantage of the situation. He urged McClellan to seize his opportunity. He proposed to hold his own at the Beaver Dam line, slightly reinforced, while General McClellan moved the main body of the army upon Richmond. The general commanding had not resolution enough to accept or reject this proposition of his gallant subordinate. He returned to his own headquarters to make up his mind, and about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning sent his final order to Porter to retire to a position some 4 miles east, behind Boatswain Swamp, and there await the further attack of the enemy. General Porter's personal devotion to McClellan, which was afterwards to bring him into lifelong trouble, has never allowed him to criticize this decision of his chief, which overruled his own bold and intelligent plan. Let us see how the ablest and most efficient Confederate general engaged in this campaign regarded it. General Longstreet says, "In my judgment, the evacuation of Beaver Dam Creek was very unwise on the part of the Federal commanders. We had attacked at Beaver Dam and had failed to make an impression at that point, losing several thousand men and officers. This demonstrated that the position was safe. If the Federal commanders knew of Jackson's approach on the 26th, they had ample time to reinforce Porter's right before Friday morning, 27th, with men and field defenses to such extent as to make the remainder of the line to the right secure against assault. So that the Federals in withdrawing not only abandoned a strong position, but gave up the morale of their success and transferred it to our somewhat disheartened forces. For next to Malvern Hill, the sacrifice at Beaver Dam was unequaled in demoralization during the entire summer." It is hard to understand what General McClellan means when he says in his report that the 26th was the day upon which I had decided as the time for our final advance. If he thought it safe to attack Richmond with Lee and his army in front of him, how much more advantageous would such an attack have been with Lee and 2/3 of his army engaged in a desperate battle north of the Chickahominy? There is no indication in his orders or dispatches of these days, if we accept one order to Porter, hereafter to be mentioned, that he had any more definite purpose than to await the action of the enemy and retreat to the James if necessary. His mind was filled with the idea of an army of 200,000 under Lee. In his report, written a year afterwards, he reiterates and dwells upon this already disproved fiction, basing his persistent belief on the reports of his detective service. This is the only explanation possible of his action during this momentous week, while he was flying from myriads which existed only in his own brain, and his brave army was turning and checking Lee's pursuing forces at every halt it made. On the morning of the 27th, Porter withdrew to his new position, famous ever thereafter as the battlefield of Gaines's Mill, or of the Chickahominy, as it is called by Southern writers. His ground, like that of the day before, was admirably chosen for defense. He had less than 1/3 the number of the host which was marching by every road on the west and north to destroy him. He knew his force was too small to defend so long a line against such numbers, but his appeals to McClellan for reinforcements brought no response until late in the day, when Slocum's division was sent him. With the troops he made a magnificent fight, which makes us speculate on what might have happened if he had commanded the entire Army of the Potomac on that day. With the exception of the 9 brigades left on the south side of the river under Magruder and Huger to hold McClellan, the whole army of General Lee, numbering over 60,000 men, was advancing upon Porter's single corps. It was led by the best generals of the South, Longstreet, the two Hills, Whiting, Hood, Ewell, and the redoubtable Jackson, whose corps, though marching with less than their usual celerity, had turned Beaver Dam Creek the night before, and had now arrived at the post assigned them opposite Porter's right. General Lee commanded on the field in person, and Jefferson Davis contributed whatever his presence was worth. The battle began at noon, and as evening fell upon the desperately fought field, the entire Confederate army, by a simultaneous advance, forced back the Union troops, overcome by numbers and wearied with 7 hours of constant fighting. There was no confusion except at the point on the right where Morrell's line had been pierced by Hood's brigade, where 2 regiments were made prisoner. Everywhere else the Union soldiers retired fighting, turning from time to time to beat back the enemy until night put an end to the conflict. Porter had lost 4,000 in killed and wounded, 1/6 of his men; Lee something more, about 1/12 of his. The loss in missing was much larger on the Union side than on the Confederate. Lee had absolutely failed in his object, to dislodge the Union army from its position and drive it down the Chickahominy. Of the heroic valor of this sanguinary day's work there can be no question. There is much question of the wisdom of it. If McClellan had made up his mind to retreat to the James, he might have withdrawn Porter to the south side of the Chickahominy during the night of the 26th, after his signal victory at Beaver Dam. But as we have seen, he gave no definite orders until 3 o'clock the next morning, when he directed Porter to retire to Gaines's Mill. During all the terrible conflict of the 27th, he left his gallant subordinate to fight his force, with no intimation of his ultimate purpose. Porter had a right to think that the price of his tremendous sacrifice was to be the capture of Richmond. McClellan's orders to him on the 23d included these words: "The troops on this side will be held ready either to support you directly or to attack the enemy in their front. If the force attacking you is large, the general would prefer the latter course, counting upon your skill and the admirable troops under your command to hold their own against superior numbers long enough for him to make the decisive movement which will determine the fate of Richmond." In addition to this, we have the most unimpeachable authority for saying that Porter on the battlefield was left with the same impression. General Webb, who was present with General Porter during the fight, ordered to that duty from McClellan's headquarters, says he carried with him to General Porter the distinct impression then prevailing at the headquarters of the army that he was to hold this large force of the enemy on the left bank of the Chickahominy in order that General McClellan with the main army might break through and take Richmond. It was this inspiring thought which moved Porter and his men to such a prodigious feat of arms. General Webb says, "The sacrifice of Gaines's Mill was warranted if we were to gain Richmond by making it, and the troops engaged in carrying out this plan, conceiving it to be the wish of the general commanding, were successful in holding the rebels on the left bank. But the general commanding was incapable of the effort of will necessary to carry out his share of the plan." He gives us to understand in his report and in subsequent articles that he resolved upon his retreat to the James on the 25th of June. General Webb adopts this theory and adds that McClellan thought that the capture of Richmond with Lee beyond the Chickahominy was not a proper military movement. It is not in the competence of anyone to judge what were General McClellan's thoughts and intentions from the 23rd to the 27th of June. So late as 8 o'clock on the night of the 27th, a dispatch from him to the War Department indicates that he thought the attack of Magruder on the right bank was more serious than that upon Porter on the left. "I may be forced," he says, "to give up my position during the night, but will not if it is possible to avoid it." And as a matter of course, the usual refrain follows: "Had I 20,000 fresh and good troops, we would be sure of a splendid victory to morrow." Magruder, who had been left to guard Richmond with only 25,000 troops, had been all day repeating the devices which were so successful at Yorktown. He had rattled about McClellan's entire front with so much noise and smoke as to create the impression of overwhelming numbers. Even the seasoned corps commanders were not unaffected by it. Franklin thought it not prudent to send any reinforcements from his line to Porter. Sumner offered to send 2 brigades, but thought it would be hazardous. The real state of the case can best be seen from Magruder's own report. He says, "From Friday night until Sunday morning I considered the situation of our army as extremely critical and perilous. The larger portion of it was on the opposite side of the Chickahominy. The bridges had been all destroyed, but one was rebuilt, the New Bridge, which was commanded fully by the enemy's guns from Golding's, and there were but 25,000 men between his army of 100,000 and Richmond. Had McClellan massed his whole force in column and advanced it against any point of our line of battle, as was done at Austerlitz, under similar circumstances, by the greatest captain of any age, though the head of his column would have suffered greatly, its momentum would have insured him success and the occupation of our works about Richmond, and consequently the city might have been his reward. His failure to do so is the best evidence that our wise commander fully understood the character of his opponent." D. H. Hill says the same thing. During Lee's absence, Richmond was at the mercy of McClellan. The fortifications around Richmond at that time were very slight. McClellan could have captured the city with very little loss of life. The want of supplies would have forced Lee to attack him as soon as possible, with all the disadvantages of a precipitated movement. General McClellan did not visit the field of battle during the day. At night he summoned Porter across the river, and there made known to him and the other corps commanders for the first time his intention to change his base to the James. Porter was ordered to retire to the south bank and destroy the bridges after him. This was accomplished safely and in good order, and the bridges were destroyed soon after sunrise on the 28th. The movement to the James once resolved upon, it was executed with great energy and ability. General Keyes moved his corps with artillery and baggage across the White Oak Swamp, and possessed himself of the ground on the other side for the covering of the passage of the other troops and the trains by noon of the 28th. General Porter's corps, during the same day and night, crossed the White Oak Swamp and established itself in positions that covered the roads from Richmond. Franklin withdrew from the extreme right after a skirmish at Golding's Farm. Keyes and Porter continued in the advance and established their 2 corps safely at Malvern Hill, thus securing the extreme left flank of the army in a commanding and important situation. This movement took General Lee completely by surprise. Anticipating nothing but a retreat down the Chickahominy, he had thrown his left wing and his entire cavalry force in that direction. When he became aware of his mistake, a good deal of precious time was already lost, and he was deprived, during the 3 days that followed, of Stuart's invaluable services. But on the 29th, having ascertained that McClellan was marching to the James, he immediately started in pursuit, sending his whole force by parallel roads to intercept the Army of the Potomac near Charles City Crossroads, midway between the White Oak Swamp and the James. Longstreet was to march with A. P. Hill by the Long Bridge Road, while Huger was to come up at the same time by the Charles City Road, and General Holmes was to take up position below him on the River Road. Jackson, crossing the Grapevine Bridge, was to come in from the north on the rear of the Federal army. Even the terrible lessons of Beaver Dam and Gaines's Mill had not convinced General Lee of the danger of attacking the Army of the Potomac in position. These lessons were repeated all along the line of march. Sumner repulsed Magruder at Allen's Farm, and then retiring to Savage's Station, he and Franklin met another fierce onslaught from the same force and completely defeated them. It was with the greatest difficulty that Franklin could induce the gallant old general to leave the field. McClellan's orders were positive that the White Oak Swamp must be crossed that night, but to all Franklin's representations, Sumner answered, "No, General, you shall not go, nor will I." When shown McClellan's positive orders, he cried out, "McClellan did not know the circumstances when he wrote that note. He did not know that we would fight a battle and gain a victory. He only gave way and reluctantly took up his line of march for the southward on the positive orders of an aide-de-camp who had just left McClellan. The next day occurred the battle of Glendale, or Frazier's Farm, as it is sometimes called. Jackson, with unusual slowness, had arrived at Savage's Station the day before, too late to take part in the battle there, and when he came to White Oak Swamp, the bridge was gone, and Franklin occupied the heights beyond. His force was therefore neutralized during the day. He made once or twice a feeble attempt to cross the swamp, but was promptly met and driven back by Franklin. Huger on the Charles City road failed to break through some slight obstruction there. Holmes was in terror of the gunboats near Malvern Hill and could give no assistance, so that Longstreet and A. P. Hill were forced to attack the Union center at Glendale on pretty nearly even terms. Here a savage and obstinate conflict took place, which was felt on both sides to be the crisis of the campaign. If the Union center had been pierced, the disaster would have been beyond calculation. On the other hand, if our army had been concentrated at that point and had defeated the army of Lee, the city of Richmond would have been the prize of victory. General Franklin says that the Prince de Joinville, who was at that moment taking leave of the army to return to Europe, said to him with great earnestness, "Advise General McClellan to center his army at this point and fight the battle today. If he does, he will be in Richmond tomorrow." Neither side won the victory that day, though each deserved it by brave and persistent fighting. General McClellan, intent upon searching for a defensive position for his army upon the James, left the field before the conflict began, while Longstreet, Lee, and Jefferson Davis himself were under the fire of the Union guns during the afternoon. When darkness put an end to the fighting, the Federal generals, left to their discretion, had accomplished their purpose. The enemy had been held in check. The trains and artillery had gone safely forward by the road which the battle had protected, and on the next morning, July 1, the Army of the Potomac was awaiting its enemy in the natural fortress of Malvern Hill. It was at this place that General Lee's contempt for his enemy was to meet its last and severest chastisement. The position strikingly resembled the battlefield of Gaines's Mill. The Union army was posted on a high position in lines selected and established by General Humphreys, covered on the right and on the left by swampy streams and winding ravines. Woods in front furnished a cover for the formation of the Confederate columns, but an open space intervening afforded full play for the terrible Federal artillery. It was not the place for a prudent general to attack, and Lee was usually one of the most prudent of generals. But he had his whole army well in hand, Jackson having come up in the night, and he decided to risk the venture. D. H. Hill took the liberty of representing the great strength of McClellan's position and to give his opinion against an assault. Longstreet, who was present, laughed and said, "Don't get scared now that we have got him whipped." It was this belief in the demoralization of the Federal army, Hill says, that made our leader risk the attack. Lee evidently thought the position could be carried by a coup de main. The order to his generals of division is a curiosity of military literature. Batteries have been established to rake the enemy's line. If it is broken, as is probable, Armistead, who can witness the effect of the fire, has been ordered to charge with a yell. Do the same. On the part of the Confederates, the battle was as ill executed as it was ill conceived. There was a vast amount of blood and valor wasted by them, while on the Union side, under the admirable leadership of Porter, Morrell, and Couch, not a drop of blood nor an ounce of powder was thrown away. Successive attacks made by the Confederates from 1 o'clock until 9 were promptly and bravely repulsed by the Union soldiers. Jackson's forces suffered severely in getting into position early in the afternoon. One of Huger's brigades charged upon Couch about 3 o'clock and was driven back, roughly handled. D. H. Hill waited a long time for the yell from Armistead, which was to be his signal for onset. But Armistead's yell in that roar of artillery was but a feeble pipe, and was soon silenced, and when Hill at last heard some shouting on his right, and concluded to advance, he was repulsed and fearfully punished by the immovable brigades of Couch and Heintzelman. The most picturesque, perhaps we may say the most sensational charge of the day was that made by Magruder late in the afternoon. His 9 brigades melted away like men of snow under the frightful fire of Sykes's batteries and the muskets of Morel's steadfast infantry. This charge closed the fighting for the day. The Union line had not been broken. One remarkable feature of the Battle of Malvern Hill was that neither of the generals commanding exercised any definite control over the progress of the fight. General Lee, it is true, was on the field, accompanied by Jefferson Davis, but with the exception of that preposterous order about Armistead's yell, he seems to have allowed his corps commanders to fight the battle in their own way. Their reports are filled with angry recriminations and show a gross lack of discipline and organization. Early in the afternoon, Lee ordered Longstreet and Hill to move their forces by the left flank, intending to cut off the expected retreat of McClellan. Longstreet says, "I issued my orders accordingly for the 2 division commanders to go around and turn the Federal right, when in some way unknown to me the battle was drawn on. We were repulsed at all points with fearful slaughter, losing 6,000 men and accomplishing nothing." General McClellan left the field in the morning before the fighting began and went to his camp at Hexhall's, which was under the protection of the gunboats. He came back for a little while in the afternoon, but remained with the right wing, where there was no fighting. He said his anxiety was for the right wing, as he was perfectly sure of the left and the center. In this way he deprived himself of the pleasure of witnessing a great victory won by the troops under the command of his subordinate generals. It is not impossible that if he had seen with his own eyes the magnificent success of the Union arms during the day, he would have held the ground which had been so gallantly defended. To judge from the accounts of the officers on both sides, nothing would have been easier. The defeat and consequent demoralization of the Confederate forces surpassed anything seen in the war, and it might have been completed by a vigorous offensive on the morning of the 2d. Even Major Dabney of Jackson's staff, whose sturdy partisanship usually refuses to recognize the plainest facts unfavorable to his side, gives this picture of the feeling of the division commanders of Jackson's corps the night of the battle. After many details of losses and disasters, they all concurred in declaring that McClellan would probably take the aggressive in the morning, and that the Confederate army was in no condition to resist him. But, impressed by the phantasm of 200,000 men before him, McClellan had already resolved to retire still farther down the James to Harrison's Landing, in order, as he says, to reach a point where his supplies could be brought to him with certainty. Commodore Rodgers, with whom he was in constant consultation, thought this could best be done below City Point. The victorious army, therefore, following the habit of the disastrous week, turned its back once more upon its beaten enemy, and established itself that day at Harrison's Bar, in a situation which Lee, having at last gained some information as to the fighting qualities of the Army of the Potomac, declined to attack, a decision in which Jackson, half of whose men were out of their ranks by death, wounds, or straggling, agreed with him. After several days of reconnaissance, he withdrew his army on the 8th of July to Richmond, and the Peninsular campaign was at an end. End of chapter 23.